I have in my hand a copy of the series Bible for The Wire, aka the best television show ever made, aka the best piece of media ever made, aka the best anything ever made in existence. This is a document that has been floating around online for a while. I'll leave a link to it in the description if you want to look through it yourself. I'll be breaking down all of the differences between the final show and this document written before the show was made. There are lots of little changes and some huge ones, so join me in taking a look at what The Wire almost was. You can think of it as like an alternate reality that begins at the same point and ends in a wildly different manner. If you're new here, consider subscribing and sticking around for more stuff like this. If you hate my voice, I don't give a shit. Go away and we'll both be happier. If you aren't familiar with what a series Bible is, it's essentially a master document for a television show. There are different types of series Bibles and they can vary widely from show to show. You can, however, slide every series Bible into one of two categories. One type is for pitching and the other type is for internal use after the show is already greenlit. This particular series Bible is a pitch Bible. The document is dated September 6th, 2000, and the show wouldn't hit the air until 2002. So plenty of time to change. The Bible was, of course, written by David Simon, and it was his roadmap for the show that was delivered to HBO, who he had already worked with before when he made The Corner. I'll take you through the series Bible in order, and it is a full 78 pages long, so let's get started. There will be spoilers moving forward, and this is kind of video is for people who are already fans of the show anyway. It's not really going to mean much how the Bible and the show change if you haven't seen the show. So the first difference between the Bible and the show is actually on page 0, right here on the title page. Handwritten on the cover page are the titles for episodes 1 through 3. These episodes would wind up being called Targets, The Detail, and The Buy, respectively, but at one point they would have been called When It's Not Your Turn, You Can't Lose If You Don't Play, and something that I can't read. This one here. Looks like it says thin tween, but I don't think that's right. Maybe think between, like think between the lines or something, but the penmanship here got lost in the photocopy. While these didn't end up being the episode titles, they did become the selected quotes that appear for the episodes right after the intro sequences, except for episode 3, because this definitely does not say, "The King Stay the King." This Bible is divided up into a number of sections, and section 1 is an overview. This quote from it demonstrates how David Simon always had the big picture in mind from the very beginning. He wrote this: "The Wire will be far more than a cop show, and to the extent that it breaks new ground, it will do so because of larger universal themes that have more to do with the human condition, the nature of the American city, and indeed the national culture." Big picture stuff from page 1. An interesting note to point out is that this series Bible does not specify Baltimore as the setting. The overview refers to the setting as an American Rust Belt city without specifying a specific city. Baltimore does get mentioned later on in the context of Baltimore street figures will serve as inspiration for storylines. Having seen the show in its final form, I think every fan would agree that it's impossible to imagine the show set anywhere other than Baltimore, Maryland. The setting is such an intrinsic part of the experience of the show. David Simon has ties to Baltimore through his days in journalism, as do other players behind the scenes, like George Pelicanos or Ed Burns, who served as a Baltimore detective for 2 decades. It's entirely possible that David Simon always intended to set the show in Baltimore and just didn't specify that when pitching to HBO. Or maybe teaming up with other members of the creative team who had ties to Baltimore also is what led to the setting. Another possibility is just that it was maybe an assumption based on the fact that they already made The Corner set in Baltimore as well. Also of note is the episode count. Obviously, since this was a pitching document, the number of episodes ordered by HBO was not set yet. This series Bible actually outlines the first season as 9 episodes, when the first season would wind up being 13 episodes long. David Simon writes, "Each season of The Wire, be it 9 or 13 episodes, exists as a standalone journey. Some characters may progress to the following season for continuity. Most others will have their stories resolved in a single season." This is something that would wind up dramatically changing. The finished show does certainly change from season to season, but the progression is less of a change of story and more of an evolution. New characters are added, but there are many characters who remain leading figures throughout all 5 seasons, and there's far less division as the world of the story continues to expand. Each season, as initially planned, would have revolved around a single case per season, meaning the Barksdale crew would have had their story wrapped up entirely by the end of the first season, and then a new investigation would have taken center stage in the subsequent seasons. This plan held somewhat true for the second season, which focuses much more on Frank Sabatka and the Docks as the central case of the season. But season 3 then returns focus to the Barksdales, and they never really left prominence throughout the second season at any rate. The next change from pitch to production is a huge one and affects the entire visual style of the show. In the pitch Bible, David Simon says of the visual aesthetic, it should be shot 16mm and handheld. This is completely different from what we ended up getting. If 16mm handheld just sounds like jargon to you, I'll show you the difference. This is 16mm handheld, and this is The Wire. The Wire was shot entirely on 35mm, and there's a little bit of handheld camera work, but not much. David Inslee, one of the show's main DPs, said of the show's cinematography in an interview, quote, "There was a lot of handheld in the first season, but it evolved and became an all long lens on a dolly look." Section 2 of the Bible is all about the setting, which we've already covered is not specified as Baltimore in particular. Though Baltimore is mentioned, and again David Simon already made The Corner, which was also set in Baltimore and served as a predecessor of The Wire in a number of ways. The Corner even gets a mention in The Wire's overview, actually. The setting is called an Eastern Rust Belt city and described to be exactly what it is on The Wire, just without explicitly calling it Baltimore at this point. Section 3 is about the major characters, and there are some huge differences here. Let's go through them one at a time. First up, McCardle. And if that name doesn't sound familiar, it's because this is who would end up being called McNulty. McCardle is obviously way worse than McNulty, because if they went with McCardle, then Bubbles couldn't have called him McNutty. I mean, I guess he still could have, but it would just be a little weirder. So he was described as Irish from the beginning. That wasn't something added after casting an English actor in Dominic West. The rest of his description is exactly what we got in the show, minus a couple things. Next up is Kima Greggs. The only real difference with Greggs is that she is described as being the protege of Lieutenant Daniels, and maybe there's a little bit of that here and there in the show, but it doesn't really come to fruition as a fully fledged thing as it was mentioned in the Bible. Speaking of Daniels, he is pretty much exactly the same in the Bible and in the show. The same cannot be said of Herc, however, who in the Bible is described as super buff, while the TV counterpart has more of a dad bod type thing going on. He was originally planned to be an anabolic steroid user and dealer, which would have been a considerably different character. Carver, one of the most lean and agile characters on the show, is described in the Bible as short and stocky and with a fire hydrant build. The rest of the description sticks pretty close to what Carver would end up being at the start of the show, but gives no hint of his eventual arc in the later seasons. When it comes to Lester, the main difference seems to be his disposition. He's described as considerably quieter and more gentle in the Bible. His surname isn't Freeman either, it's Weeks, which would end up being the surname of Johnny Weeks instead. In the Bible, Bunk gets brought onto the major crimes unit with the other main cops right from the beginning, while in the show he remains outside the unit in the homicide department for much of the series. He's described as being close to 300 pounds and on the verge of a heart attack at any moment. Later on in the Bible, Bunk actually gets described again, and this time he's over the cusp, weighing in at 320 pounds. Interestingly, there's no mention of alcoholism for either Bunk or McNulty/McCardle, though there are scenes described with them getting shit-faced later on in the treatment sections. Santangelo ends up being a relatively minor character in the series, but he had a much larger part to play as indicated by the Bible. He's planted in the major crimes unit as a mole, and his main characteristic was a severe gambling addiction. And last up for the police is the deputy commissioner, who has no name in the Bible, he's just deputy commissioner. His equivalent in the show would be Burrell, or it could be Rawls, since that's the job that he ends up taking over eventually. The character is intended to be white in the Bible. He is not corrupt, though we may doubt this at times, is a line in the series Bible. In the actual show, I think you could say it gets pushed a little bit past that. If anything, I would say the deputy commissioner in the Bible is kind of a combination of Burrell and Rawls. The judge is not Daniel Phelan in the show, but rather Judge Watkins. Other than the name change and the fact that he was written to be black in the Bible, other than that, the Bible and the series line up on this one. Perlman is in the Bible, but doesn't get too much of a description beyond the role she serves in the case, which is the same role that she serves in the show. Instead of Rhonda Perlman, her name is Janelle Perlman. No mention of her relationship with McNulty/McCardle. D'Angelo Barksdale's entire arc throughout the first season is right here in the series Bible. The Bible teases a closer, more personal relationship between D'Angelo and McCardle than what we ended up getting from D'Angelo and McNulty. D'Angelo is also described as having a casual girlfriend rather than the serious relationship and child that he has in the show, and he's described as having a fixation on expensive footwear, and I mean like full-blown obsession. It comes into play in the plot more than once, this footwear thing. Avon Barksdale is not Avon in the series Bible, but rather Aaron Barksdale. Though Avon is more hands-off in the first season than in later seasons, he is described as being even more hands-off in the series Bible. Interestingly enough, the Season 3 plot thread that sees Stringer getting involved in the real estate game is actually attributed to Aaron Barksdale in the Bible in what would have been part of Season 1. Stringer Bell was originally supposed to be called, wait for it, Stringy Bell. Ew. Just sounds gross after hearing Stringer for so long. Stringy? Ugh, yuck. Stringy is described as being older in the series Bible, and his eventual role in the show is really minimized in this Bible. He is described as being the number 2, but his role seems much smaller than it would actually end up being. And there's no hint at all of any of his own goings-on, like his community college classes, for example. Those aren't here in the Bible. Kima goes to community college in the Bible, though, actually. Bubbles is massively different in the show versus in the series Bible. In the Bible, he's 60, and he actually has AIDS. There's a whole subplot in the later seasons of the actual show where Bubbles is afraid he might have AIDS. His buddy Johnny Weeks has HIV, but when Bubbles does finally get tested, he finds out he is miraculously clean. In the show Bible, he is dying slowly of AIDS throughout this first season. Omar is pretty different in the Bible versus in the show. The two biggest changes are Omar's reputation, which isn't nearly as legendary in the Bible at the start of the show, and the other one is that he isn't openly gay in the Bible. He even has a girlfriend character that he stays with, though it is also implied that he has a male lover on the down low. It's something he hides in the Bible. And the last character described in this Bible is Bodhi. His description is short, but it lines up perfectly with what's in the show. And yes, that is the last character described, meaning there was no Wallace in the Bible.
Where the fuck is Wallace?
There's no Rawls, unless he was meant to be a combo character with Burrell as a deputy commissioner. There's no Jay Landsman in the Bible either. There's no Maurice Levy, though there is a brief mention of an unnamed drug organization lawyer. Actually, it ends up being 2 or 3 lawyers instead of just Maurice. There's no bio for Johnny Weeks, but he does get mentioned later on in the Bible. And another huge absence is Prez. There's absolutely no Prez Belusky whatsoever in this Bible. Smaller players like Poot and Weebay, they don't get descriptions either. FBI agent Fitzhugh is also absent from the Bible, though the FBI does still have a part to play. Between this Bible being written and the show being made, 9/11 happened. And I think it's extremely likely that this led to several of the changes that we ended up seeing. It's a subject that David Simon has commented on a bit in the past, even managing to sort of predict the FBI's response to 9/11, since The Wire was made before the FBI took action but released afterward. So it took significant forethought. The rest of the Bible is a detailed description of each episode of the first season as initially planned to be self-contained and 9 episodes in length. I'll take you through all of the major differences. First major difference is the opening scene of the show. Not in the Bible. Instead, we open right in the courthouse. The first scene in the Bible is the first scene that follows the opening credits of the actual show. That whole snot boogie scene, not in here. From how the scenes are described, Jimmy's Irish heritage may have played a larger role initially. He's constantly referred to as the Irishman in the descriptions. One small detail that changes between the Bible and the series is the name of the low-rises. In the show, they're called the Franklin Terrace Towers, but in the Bible, they're called the Latrobe Courts. And the actual courtyard in real life is called the Douglas Homes. The name of the nightclub changes too. It's not Orlando's in the Bible, but rather 5 Mile House Nightclub, which is a real spot in Baltimore. And actually, Orlando's is mentioned too, so I guess they ended up getting combined in the actual show. Other than those things, the first episode of the Bible lines up almost exactly with the first episode of the show, which makes sense when you're dealing with a pilot. Some scenes are shuffled around, and there are a few extra scenes in the show that aren't in the outline, but otherwise it sticks pretty closely. Into episode 102. The 2 shitty detectives that Daniels gets saddled with in the show are named Mahone and Polk, but in the Bible they're named Shea and Veritek. Other than the name change, they're the same. There are also a couple of extra cops in the detail at the start of the Bible who don't really get names, but they're described as brutal thugs, one from Vice and one from the Warrant Squad. In the show, Jimmy and Bunk talk to Bodhi and D'Angelo at that iconic couch, but in the Bible, D'Angelo gets full-on hauls into the interrogation room at this point. D'Angelo's arc is compressed in the Bible. It's a bit sped up, partially due to the 9-episode planning in place of 13. Worth noting, there's no chicken nugget conversation in the Bible.
It ain't about right, it's about money. Now you think Ronald McDonald gonna go down that basement and say, "Hey, Mr. Nugget, you the bomb. We selling chicken faster than you can tear the bone out. So I'm gonna write my clowny ass name on this fat ass check for you." Shit.
Since Prez isn't in the Bible, the scene where he clocks a teenager with his pistol instead has Carver doing the clocking. Also, instead of the classic shitbird line, he goes with the more mainstream shitbag. Jimmy's catchphrase of "what did I do?" is actually uttered by Bubbles in The Wire instead of Jimmy. The story D'Angelo tells in The Low Rises about killing the ex and the actual killing itself are both different in the Bible and in the show. It's left a little bit ambiguous in the show whether he did the shooting himself or not. I mean, you can put it together. But in the Bible, all the details are spelled out. In the Bible, D'Angelo knocks on the glass just like in the show, except when she comes up to the glass, Stringer steps up from behind D'Angelo, and he's the one who shoots through the glass. The Clay Davis figure is mentioned in episode 2 of the Bible, except instead of Clay Davis, he's called Senator James L. Dawkins instead. At this point in the Bible, Lester goes to the gym and tracks down the picture of Avon, or I guess Aaron, but in the show that doesn't happen until episode 3. Same deal with the scene where D'Angelo chops up Chardine. It's in episode 3 of the show, but in the Bible it's actually way back in episode 1. But the Bible does specify that she will eventually become an informant right from her first introduction. Also, she does not have a name in the Bible. She's just referred to as a B-girl dancer. There's a lot of scene shuffling due to restructuring the show from 9 episodes to 13, without the scenes themselves actually changing much or at all. The scene where D'Angelo makes a faux pas with a dessert cart in the fancy restaurant is another example. In the Bible, that's part of episode 2, but in the show, that doesn't happen until all the way in episode 5. Now in episode 3 of the Bible, Sid Noor goes undercover on the streets just like in the show, but he does not get pointers from Bubbles. That great scene, not in the Bible. In the show, Bodie punches Mahone, while in the Bible, Bodie hits Veritek with a baseball bat. The end result is the same, with one of the loser detectives laid up in hospital soaking up his pension and with Bodie getting horribly assaulted by the police. There's a scene unique to the Bible where Herc buys a large quantity of steroids from another cop. There's also an extra police brutality scene where Herc, Carver, and 2 other cops beat a man unconscious who they think is stealing a car, but he's actually just locked himself out of his own car and he's trying to get back in. When they realize this, they run away. Next major change is a scene that got much better between pitch and production. Mercado's looking through old cases that have a connection to Barksdale, and he finds one of Santangelo's old cases that never got solved, leading to the iconic fuck investigation scene in the show. One of my absolute favorite scenes in the entire show.
Motherfucker. Fucking A.
But in the Bible, the whole fuck angle is not part of the scene. The scene's there, fuck angle is not there. The actual dialogue is written out explaining all the detective work as they go through it. And there's a twofold change, because the second part is that Bunk is absent. In place of Bunk, it's Jimmy and Kima. The other little change is that instead of the bullet being found on the refrigerator door, it's just in the baseboard of the wall. Not quite as clever. Then there's another Bible-specific scene with Herc continuing his steroid subplot. He goes to a gym and sells some steroids to a random dude. The scene from the show where Bodie just walks out of juvie holding and he goes home, and it's not shown in the Bible, but he does show back up, and then he explains what happened. He talks about getting hauled off to Boys Village, then he tells this story of walking out to D'Angelo. We just don't see it happen. It's a tell don't show moment in the Bible versus the other way around in the show. In both the Bible and the show, Omar is introduced in episode 3, but his introduction is completely different. One of the largest changes is Omar's reputation, or the lack thereof in the Bible. People don't recognize him in the Bible and know him by name like they do in the show. He's already got a semi-legendary persona on the streets in the show. He's already infamous amongst the Barksdales, but in the Bible, no one knows who the hell he is at first. In his first scene in the Bible, him and his crew are actually introduced in a way that's meant to mislead the audience into thinking that they are drug cops on a stakeout of the Barksdale operation. This ruse continues with the actual Barksdale crew as well. The Bible says the stick-up is so smooth that until they're all against the wall, D'Angelo's Confederation thinks it's the police. In the Bible, D'Angelo has a grandmother, and this is who he really cares about. She doesn't know anything about the drug business, and instead she thinks that D'Angelo works in construction. D'Angelo also has an absentee sister who abandoned 2 children, and these children are now being raised by this grandmother character. It's a completely different family dynamic than in the show. That's the end of episode 3 in the Bible, and there's one major absence. The chess scene, arguably the show's single most famous scene, nowhere to be found. Into episode 4 now. Prop Joe's character is first mentioned in this episode, except in the Bible he's called Doughboy. The bounds of his territory seem to be a little bit different too, but not too different. Next is a scene where Aaron Barksdale listens to a middle-aged woman who's fallen in hard times and gives her $500 out of his pocket. In the Bible, once the pages get cloned, the monitoring setup is completely different. It's actually just McCardle and Kima who are watching a half dozen pages each. They clip them onto their belts and they carry them around with them wherever they go. The East Side-West Side basketball game happens in episode 4 of the Bible, but not until episode 9 of the actual show. There's no Herc and Carver mingling and watching the game in the Bible, though. But McCardle and Greggs do use the game as a surveillance opportunity to start matching up faces to the pagers. The next big difference is Brandon's death scene. He actually doesn't get a name in the Bible, but he fills Brandon's role as the member of Omar's team that gets got. Not Omar's boyfriend, since Omar actually has a girlfriend in the Bible. Instead, he's described as being pretty young and just a friend of Omar's crew, but it is hinted at that they do have a romantic relationship on the DL. The Barksdales roll up on him in the same exact situation as they do in the show, but instead of hauling him off and making an example of him like they do in the show, they just gun him down right then and there. They don't do the whole pretending to be cops thing that happens in the show. There's nothing at all to Kima's home life in the Bible. She does have a girlfriend, but that's the extent of it in the Bible. Greg's at-home domestic scene with girlfriend. That's it. That's all that gets said in the Bible. There's no pregnancy thing. There's no argument over her line of work. None of that. In the Bible, Omar finds out Brandon's death when McCardle and Greg show up at his door and tell him. Omar is a whole lot less elusive in the Bible. The cops can just roll up to his front door. They know where he is. They even bring Omar all the way into the interrogation room, and he goes willingly. There's a scene in the Bible where Herc, Carver, and Sidnor all testify in court against all of the low-level players that have been scooped up so far, which seems like it must mean the end of Sidnor's undercover work with his crew. The follow the money talk is a little bit altered in the Bible, but it does still happen. The police show up to a stash house, and it's revealed to belong to the woman that Barksdale gave that $500 to earlier, not simply the act of generosity it at first seemed. Another detail from the Bible is that one of the people to scatter from the stash house is the ringer basketball player that Barksdale recruited earlier in that episode. The basketball player actually gets into a knife fight with Kima, and he hurts her pretty badly. He even hits her over the head with a pipe at one point. She draws her gun on him, doesn't fire, he runs off. She gets rushed to the hospital. D'Angelo sends the ball player off on a train to lie low. Kind of like they do for Weebay on the show, but Weebay doesn't exist. In the Bible, Bodhi starts getting more respect and responsibility by episode 4. Stringer, or Stringy, splits dealing into 2 shifts, giving D'Angelo the night shift and giving the day shift to Bodhi, who immediately gets stuck up by Omar. Now we're in episode 5 of the Bible. One nice little character detail in the Bible is that McCardle has a degree in philosophy. Without Prez in play in the Bible, it's Kima who first cracks the code with the numbers. Omar's girlfriend comes into play when Barksdale shooters roll up to her house to try to ambush him. The house gets pretty much destroyed and the girlfriend gets wounded, but Omar slips away. One subplot from the Bible that didn't make it into the show sees D'Angelo turn over a 15-year-old underneath him to Stringy, who then has a couple guys beat the piss out of the kid. D'Angelo feels bad at first, but then some of the kid's blood gets on his shoes and he freaks out and starts attacking the kid too. Because again, in the Bible, D'Angelo has a full-blown obsession with shoes. Slim Charles shows up in this episode, which is pretty cool since in the show, Slim Charles doesn't make his first appearance until all the way in season 3. I mean, he's pretty much Slim Charles in name only, though. As opposed to Anwar Glover, who actually played Slim Charles. In the Bible, the Slim name is meant to be ironic, as he's described as being, quote, the fattest human being possible, end quote. Then comes probably the single biggest difference to the entire show. In episode 10 of the show, Kima is part of an undercover sting with the DEA when she is shot and critically wounded. The equivalent of this event in the Bible happens much earlier, in episode 5, and it plays out much, much differently. The location is completely different to start with. Instead of a car and an empty lot, the setting is actually inside of Orlando's club. D'Angelo himself is directly involved, as he is the one who recognizes Kima and outs her to the others. Slim Charles and these other 2 guys attack her. She fights back, kills one of them, but then Kima, she dies. She gets killed in the Bible, right in episode 5. Then episode 6 is wildly different all throughout. The episode opens with Kima's funeral. In the wake of Kima's killing, D'Angelo gets hauled into the interrogation room and McCardle beats the hell out of him, while Bunk turns a blind eye. D'Angelo rolls over on Slim Charles, who is currently in the hospital from a knife wound that Kima gave him, but Slim Charles is saying that he got it in a card game. Bunk and Santangelo drag Slim Charles and another muscle member out of the hospital. Stringy Bell meets with the cops under the supervision of Maurice Levy, except instead of Maurice Levy, it's two different unnamed lawyers. Stringy also rolls on Slim Charles, completely sells him out, but swears that he and Barksdale had nothing to do with that business, and that Slim just uses the same location since he and Orlando go way back and they did time together. He also sells out Slim's compatriots and promises that he'll make sure everyone at Orlando's cooperates with the investigation. D'Angelo cracks in this episode. He's ready to confess by episode 6 in the Bible. He comes clean on everything. Just to reiterate at this point, there is no Wallace in the Bible at all. There's no character that fills in for Wallace and serves that same role either. It just doesn't happen. I'll also note at this point that while Lester still acts the same and is still leagues above most cops, he's far less active and involved in the Bible. He gets that picture of Avon or Aaron, and he does some work with informants, but that's the extent of it for him so far. Interestingly, even though Omar's reputation seems fairly minimized in the Bible versus in the show, he does still talk to McCardle about how he pulls off what he does and how it's all about reputation. This is something that luckily got smoothed out between pitch and production. The scene where Jimmy goes to his son's soccer game with Bubbles in the show is in the Bible, but instead of Bubbles, it's D'Angelo who's with him. After D'Angelo returns to the low-rises, word has already reached Stringy through his mole in the police detail. Stringy acts like he doesn't even know who D'Angelo is. It's kind of like that moment from later on in the show where Stringer suspects Bodie might be wearing a wire.
Well, you shouldn't sell drugs.
D'Angelo doesn't know he's been caught out until Bodie kicks his ass right in front of everyone and calls him a snitch. All of D'Angelo's guys now work for Bodie, who rises through the ranks much faster in the Bible. When D'Angelo gets home, he finds that his porch has been vandalized with the word snitch spray painted across the front of it. At the end of episode 6, the FBI finally steps in, interested in following the money. No Fitzhugh though, just nameless FBI suits. D'Angelo calls McCardle for help after his beating, and McCardle actually brings D'Angelo home to sleep on his couch. Now on to episode 7, which opens with Daniels turning down the FBI's help, since it would take the case away from him and his people. McCardle and D'Angelo get a lot closer than McNulty and D'Angelo ever did. McCardle shepherds D'Angelo around after he's found out as a snitch openly. D'Angelo's hanging around for days on end. He's even right there in the room once the wiretap on the payphones finally gets up and running. McCardle even goes on a day trip with his kids and D'Angelo to Washington, D.C. to take a look at the monuments. D'Angelo even jokes about McCardle adopting him in the Bible. No one knows what's going to happen to D'Angelo after the case is over. There's no budget for witness protection, and he definitely cannot go back to his old life. So this is a big question that hangs in the air. What's going to happen to D'Angelo? Lester and Sidner scoop up a drug mule on his way to a drop-off with the Barksdales, and they end up snagging $400,000 worth of heroin. One of the real estate projects that Aaron Barksdale is involved with is revealed to be a co-endeavor with Doughboy, the Prop Joe stand-in. Into episode 8 now. By this point, Bubbles is badly suffering from the effects of HIV. He's described as wraith-like and in the final stages. There's a whole bait and switch where the Barksdales send Muscle to a Motel 6 where they think D'Angelo is hiding out, but it turns out to be empty. The mole business with Santangelo goes so much deeper in the Bible than any mole business in the show, even more than all that mole business with Lieutenant Marimo in season 4. Orlando's club gets renamed to Odell's. No connection to Odell Watkins, just a coincidence, same name. Both Bubbles and Omar go up to Stringy wearing wires at different times. Everything goes smoothly with Bubbles, but when it's Omar's turn, Bill has Muscle grab him up and they make him strip. They don't find any mic though. Omar meets with Aaron Barksdale and offers to wipe the slate clean, expunge the vendetta. He offers to kill D'Angelo for him before he can testify. Aaron agrees, and now he's caught on tape commissioning a hit on his own nephew. Herc gets arrested by a DEA agent for selling steroids. Apparently the DEA has been working on catching Herc for the past 6 months, and now they finally have. Except the truth is that this bust only came about as a result of the mole through the deputy commissioner, and that put a stop to the investigation. This is a problem for the whole wiretap case since Herc's name is on the affidavits. Herc and Carver stealing money from a bus does not happen in the Bible, just in the show. And one Mr. Fuzzy Dunlop is also completely absent from the Bible. The dancer from Orlando's does become an informant, and she does help with the case. She even still gets along well with Lester and all that, but the whole business with her, like counting steps, to the count room and all that. That's not in the Bible. She just wears a wire and picks up some conversations in the Bible. That's it. Santangelo, who in the Bible is so deeply crooked that he even sold out Lester, Sidnor, Herc, and Carver and was willing to nearly get them all murdered by Barksdale Muscle at the motel, is now in custody. Lester and Sidnor bring him into the bathroom and they beat the piss out of him. The episode ends with Aaron Barksdale cuffed to the interrogation room table. Now for episode 9, the final episode of the Bible. Months have passed since the last scene in the previous episode. Jump in time here. The righteous judge who got the whole investigation started ends up being just as crooked as everyone else, now that it's time for his re-election for another 15-year term. Herc is losing his job over the steroid rap. He gets to resign instead of being fired. Bubbles is laid up in an AIDS treatment ward. McCardle visits him for a final goodbye. D'Angelo goes through with testifying in court. Sidnor, Carver, and McCardle all testify too, against Aaron, Stringy, and a bunch of mid-level players. Lester and the dancer have an actual date at the harbor. A real couple, it seems. She even gives him a new piece of dollhouse furniture as a gift. Barksdale gets found guilty. McCardle goes to tell Bubbles, but his bed is empty. He's dead and gone. That is the end of Bubbles in the Bible reality. Next is the Stringy Bell trial, and he gets found not guilty. So this all lines up pretty well with what happens in the show. It just comes about in a different manner. At Bell's trial, the jurors believe that McCardle planted evidence at the apartment murder scene with the bullet in the wall and the casing outside the window. The police now have to figure out what to do with D'Angelo. They bring him to a train station, not knowing where to send him. He mentions he has an aunt in Atlanta, so they send him there. They buy a ticket right then and there. Lester and especially McCardle feel really bad for him. They give him all the money they've got on him, and then McCardle even goes to an ATM to take out more money for him. Now that their hand in the case is over, McCardle gives the wiretap evidence over to that FBI contact so that they can further their own investigation. We join D'Angelo in Atlanta, back on the corner slinging, the only game he knows. It looks like this is what got repurposed as the end of Marlowe's arc. And it works much better as that. It makes more sense for that character than it does for D'Angelo. The Bible season ends the exact same way as the show, with Omar pulling a stick up, laughing, and a fade to black. Those were all of the differences between the Wire as it was pitched and the Wire as it was produced. The season starts off extremely similar, goes way off course in the latter half of the season, but then wraps up right at the very end in pretty much the same kind of way, minus the huge changes that would have left ripples all throughout the subsequent seasons. The death of Kima and Bubbles, for instance. Though as described in the Bible, the next season wouldn't have seen any of these leads return, probably. So, there you have it. If you enjoyed this, then subscribe to the channel for more stuff like it. This took a very long time to put together. My script for this thing was 30 pages long. So I'd appreciate if you subscribe and check out some of my video essays, or if you're interested, you can grab yourself a copy of my post-apocalyptic novel, The Fall of Polite. You can click on the screen here for videos with more information on that. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.